All right, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. I want to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av. To thank Max and Brenda Lapkovsky for dedicating all the Shir Midrashos this month in honor of their son Yitzchak Meir's upcoming bar mitzvah. Dr. Riva Mitzner for dedicating the Shir Midrashos this month in commemoration of the first yarzheit of her father, Dr. Larry Schneck, Aryeh Ben Chaim, Zichron Livracha, and Jack Bennett in honor of Sargent Omer Tviv, who was killed by a Hamas Anti-Tank Missile on the Gaza border on May 12th in 2021. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in a chama. But we have a very exciting daf ahead of us today. So today's daf is Chaf Beis 22. We actually left off at the Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b. So the Mishnah says as follows. Also, I sent out the pictures on the link. On the WhatsApp chat yesterday, so we'll be referencing them as we go through the dapim as well. So the Mishnah says as follows: Hasomich sukaso bekari hamito. If a person goes ahead and supports his sukkah, literally again, bekari hamita means on the poles of a bed. So you could see over here, this is picture 132. So the imagery that's being presented over here is you have a bed. The bed itself has walls, right? Or has like a bed frame, but an extended bed frame. You're making your sukkah, you're supporting the schach on the top of this bed frame. So what's the halacha? What's the status? Kshera. Mishnah says, sukkah is kasher. Yehuda Omer, im eino yachol lano b'fnei atzmo psula. And Rabbi Yehuda says that that's not the case. Rabbi Yehuda says that halacha l'maisa, if the sukkah is unable to go ahead and stand independently, then the sukkah is going to be pasul. Okay, so says the Gemara, my time Rabbi Yehuda. I understand the Tanna Kama, because according to the Tanna Kama, if you look at the picture, again, you could see it on 132, you look at the picture, this seems like a pretty self-standing, self-sufficient sukkah, and therefore should be okay. What's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Why ultimately, again, would such a sukkah not be kosher? So, Pligi bar Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Abba bar Mamel. So, both said there's a machlokes. Machlokes Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Abba bar Mamel as to what Rabbi Yehuda's problem is. Chad Omar, mipnei she'in lakeva. One opinion said that halacha l'maisa, it's too impermanent. I will say, and Rashi points out that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the sukkah is a diras keva. Sukkah is diras keva. So remember again, sukkah requires some level of permanence, and the act of placing it on the bed frame, by definition, is impermanent. B'chad amar mipnei shema'amida b'davar hamakabel tuma. The other opinion says no. The problem with supporting the schach on the bed frame is that the bed frame is mekabel tuma. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Shema amida v'afa pishol v'amadnu psul ela l'schach hoil v'ikaro shel schach elu ma'amidin havikilu sichich b'davar hamakabel tuma. Now we'll say this is very interesting because up until now we've spoken about the fact that schach can't be mekabel tuma. Right? Schach has to be made from something that's not mekabel tuma. What we never spoke about before was supporting schach with something that is mekabel tuma. So suddenly comes along the Gemara and says, Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can't go ahead and put the schach on top of a bed frame because the bed frame is mekabel tuma. So Rashi says, so what? So what? What does it matter if the bed frame is mekabel tuma? So this is very interesting. Rashi says the logic is as follows. Since it is the frame which holds up the schach, the frame itself takes on a quasi-schach identity, to the point that the halachos that govern the schach will govern the frame which holds up the schach. So the schach can't be makabel tuma. So to the frame which holds up the schach can't be makabel tuma as well. Okay, so the Gemara says, "My benay." But we'll get into that a little bit more. My benay. What is the practical difference between these two opinions? I'll tell you. Kigon shena'at shipudin shel barzel. A good example would be what happens if you took metal poles or metal spits, right, and you went ahead and you drove them into the ground and put the schach on top of that. If you hold that the problem with the bed is impermanence, well, metal spits have permanence, so it should be okay. However, but according to the opinion who says that halacha l'maisa, the problem with the bed is that you're establishing or you're holding up the schach with an item that is Mekabel Tumah, Hare Ma'amida B'Davra HaMekabel Tumah. Certainly, again, metal spits are what? Absolutely Mekabel Tumah. Amr Abaye. So Abaye says, Lo Shanu Ella Samach. Aval Sichech Agabe Mita Kshera. The only problem, the Gemara says, is halacha l'maisa. If you were literally, I should say, the only machlokes between the Rabbanon and the Mishnah and Tanna Kama is when you're literally putting the schach on top of the bed structure. So remember again, the case that the Mishnah was operating with was the bed has walls. If you could imagine, you have a 3-walled bed, and the walls extend up. You are literally putting the schach on top of the walls. That's where Rabbi Yehuda has his problem, either because there's a davar hamakabel tumah, or ultimately, again, it lacks keva. What happens, however, says Abaye in the following situation? We'll say this is picture 133. So if you look over here, this is a little bit different. Here, if you notice, essentially, what you have is you have 4 poles. You have 4 poles, and the poles are holding up the sukkah. The bed structure is inside the sukkah itself. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, in this case, you're not holding up the schach with what we call the walls of the bed. Rather, you've put into the ground 4 independent poles. And what happens? Aval kol dofnei sukkah einon ella mitos mishloshet stadim. So we'll say, listen to this. What's happening in this case? In this case, you're not supporting the schach on the bed, but rather, what function is the bed serving? What is the bed doing? The bed is serving as the walls of the schach. This is very important. So Rabbi says, even Rabbi Yehuda would say this is okay. This is kshera. My taima. So we'll listen to this. Very simple. Leman daron lefi she'in lo keva, harei yesh la keva. According to the opinion who says the problem with the bed is, I will say, since a bed is a movable entity, it wasn't keva. This would be keva. Why would this be keva? Because what are you doing? How are you setting up the schach? 4 poles planted into the ground. So that endows it with the keva identity. And according to the opinion who says that you're going ahead and holding up the schach or establishing the schach with a davar, with something that is mekabel tumah, we'll say, by the way, because remember, a bed is a kli, that's why it's mekabel tumah. So ultimately, again, harein ma'amida b'davar hamakabel tumah. This would be a case, ultimately, again, where one would not be holding it up with a davar hamakabel tumah. Good. So we'll say, so therefore, again, the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon will be in a case where you're mamish utilizing the walls of the bed to hold up the schach. But it appears that everybody will agree that if you're putting up 4 poles, holding up the schach that way, just using the bed walls to go ahead and serve as the walls of the sukkah, that ultimately would be okay. Beautiful. But let's say come to Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, an interesting couple of cases over here. So we'll say, listen to this. Says the Mishnah, Sukkah hamiduvleles. A sukkah that is miduvleles. Now, we will discuss exactly what miduvleles means. Rashi says over here, the kaman mefarish begemara. The Gemara will explain what this term means. So, sukkah miduvleles, or we'll see how to read the Mishnah. Vishetzilasa meruba mechamasa. Or the sukkah provides more shade than sun. Now, that's a good thing, right? Sukkah, we'll see what that means. Sukkah provides more shade than sun. In these cases, kshera. The sukkah is kosher. Okay? Hame'uva come in by. Suppose that this is a fascinating case which we will discuss. What happens if the sukkah, the schach, is so thick that it has like literally me'uva come by means the sukkah, the schach, is so thick that it's like the roof of a home. Like the roof of a home. What's the halacha? Rashi says, Shesichech shala av ma'od. The schach is very thick. What's the halacha? Afapi she'ina kochavim nira misocha. Even though you cannot see the stars when you are standing or sitting inside the sukkah, kshera. Ultimately, again, the sukkah is going to be kosher. Good. So we'll say, so let's understand. Says the Gemara, my miduvleles, by the way, what is a sukkah miduvleles? So let's get My picture's right over here. Good. What is a sukkah? What is a sukkah meduvlalas? Amar Rav, sukkah aniyah. Rav says it's a poor sukkah, a nebuchal sukkah. What's a nebuchal sukkah? Rabbi say, look at Rashi aniyah. Sheyesh b'sichecha kanim ma'at v'yesh ba'avir harbe ela she'in bo shlosha biyachad. So Rabbi say, this is essentially a lightly or a sparsely, what's the right word? It's a sukkah with very sparse schach. So I will say, here's what's interesting. You could have a sukkah that is sparsely schacht, using that as a verb, sparsely schacht, and still be kosher. How? Well, say, remember again, only if there's more than 3 tefachim of airspace do you have a problem. So you could have a sukkah that has multiple pockets of airspace that are what? Less than 3 tefachim. What happens if it's less than 3 tefachim? Love it, right? It's like it's closed. So Rav says that miduvleles is a sukkah that is sparsely schacht. Not ideal, but ultimately what? Kosher. Shmuel Amar, no. Shmuel says it means something a little bit different. Shmuel says it means kana ola, kana yored. So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Kana ola v'kana yored, shelo hishva haschach. So Shmuel says miduvlalas means a sukkah where the schach is not even. You essentially have different layers of schach. What it means, kana ola, kana yore. Schach at a higher level, schach at a lower level. He says, shelo hishva schach lahash amri Rashi, lahash kiva kanim ze'etzel zeh. The way you set up the schach is that the branches, we'll call it, the reeds, are not all on one level. Ella echad lemala ve'echad lemata. Some schach is above, some schach is below. Umitoch kach chamasa miruba mitzilasa. Interestingly enough, Rabbi say, because you have schach on a higher level and a lower level, there's actually more sun than shade in the schach. Rabbi say, why? Why is that? Because remember, again, the sun gets in. Right? So because the schach is not densely packed, or I should say it's not all on one level, there's actually more sun than shade in the sukkah. The Rebbe said, now this is actually incredible. Va'ashma'inon masnisin da'aminon kol she'ilu hayu mesachachin b'shava haisa tzilasim meruba mechamasik sheira. The Rebbe said, get ready for this. So remember, this is according to Shmuel, a sukkah miduvleles is a sukkah that has schach on 2 different levels. And remember, what does the Mishnah say? What's the status of a sukkah miduvlalas? What's the status? Kosher. But one second, you just said it's chamas samiruba mitzilasa. It allows in more sun than shade. What's the chiddush Rabbosai? That essentially, we view multi-tiered or multi-level schach as if what? It's all together. And since if it were to all be together, it would provide more shade than sun. Therefore, the sukkah is going to be kosher. A pretty dramatic halacha. I will say, this is picture, although I don't know that it's such a helpful picture. Picture 134. Picture 134. You could see the schach, right? The schach, the kanim themselves, the reeds, on different levels. So I will say, this is incredible. So Rav Tani Chada, Shmuel Tani Tarti. So I will say, so now, let's go back for just a moment. So now, let's go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah spoke about this Mishnah said 2 things. Sukkah hamiduvlalas and shetzilasa meruba mechamasa. More shade than sun. And the Mishnah said it's kosher. Now you have machlokes Rav and Shmuel. What's miduvlalas? Rav said miduvlalas is a sparsely schacht sukkah, but one that is still kosher. Shmuel said that it's a sukkah with a multi-tiered schach. So now listen to this. The Gemara now says, Rav Tani Chada, according to Rav, the first 2 cases of the Mishnah are really one case. Ushmuel Tani Tarti, according to Shmuel, it's 2 cases. Rav Tani Chada, Rav says it's 1 case. Sukkah miduvlalas, because according to Rav, what's a sukkah miduvlalas? My miduvlalas, miduldeles shetzilasa meruba mechamasa kshera. It's sparsely schacht, but it still provides more shade than sun, and therefore it's going to be kosher. So according to Rav, miduvleles and silasa meruba mechamasa, it's 1 case. It's 1 case. Ushmuel Tani Tarti, Shmuel on the other hand says, no, it's 2 cases. My miduvleles, mibulbeles. What's miduvleles? According to Shmuel, ultimately, again, it's mibulbeles. Mibulbeles means the schach is a little bit mixed up. Some is higher, some is lower. So ultimately, again, v'tarti katani. And according to Shmuel, the Mishnah is coming to teach me two things. Number one, sukkah mibulbeles kashera, that if you have multi-tiered schach, right, even though you are effectively allowing in more sun than shade, the sukkah is going to be kosher. Why? Because we view all the schach as being on one level. So I will say, so just again, all the Gemara is just pointing out is the machlokes Rav and Shmuel is not only a machlokes, ultimately again in the definition of miduvleles, but it is also comes out as machlokes as what? As to how to read the Mishnah. How do you read the Mishnah? Good. So Amar Abaye says, Lo shanu ela she'ein bein ze lezeh shlosha tfachim. So we'll say, now let's go back, let's analyze this. So we'll say, this, so the truth is, if you think about it, Rav's definition is not really such a chiddush, but Shmuel's is. Right? So we'll say, think about this in just a moment. You have two-tiered schach. And ultimately, again, there really is more sun than shade getting into the sukkah, practically, right? Actually, there is more sun than shade. Yet Shmuel is holding that halacha lamaisa, we view all of the schach as being on one excuse me. Excuse me. I'm good, I promise. Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to start sneezing. Thank you so much. Say thank you. Now that you brought it. Thank you. So remember, according to Shmuel, halacha l'maisa, we're viewing all the schach as being compressed onto one level. Now, first of all, where Shmuel gets that from, we'll have to see. But let's see it now. Says Amar Abaye. So Abaye gives another qualification to Shmuel's statement. Lo shanu ela she'ein bein zeh lezeh shlosha tfachim. We'll say, when does Shmuel say that we view multi-tiered schach as being on one compressed level? That's only if what? There's less than 3 tfachim between the two levels. Which I will say makes sense. If there's less than 3 tfachim, then what? Love it. We'll say, it's just want to point out how interesting this is. That, when it comes to sukkah, right? Hilchos schach 101 is tzilasa meruba mechamasa. Right? More shade than sun. And it is fascinating here that according to Shmuel, when you have multi-tiered schach, what's happening inside of your sukkah? Right? More sun. And yet comes along Abaye and says, by the way, if there's less than 3 tfachim, you view it all as compressed. So we'll say, what's fascinating about this is, that's very nice, you view it as compressed. And what's happening as you're sitting in your sukkah? You're getting a sunburn, right? Because there's more sun than shade that's coming in. I will say it's an incredible musar that halacha defines the reality of a Jew. It's not my senses, right? It's not my perceptions. It's not my isms. It's not my personal hashkafas. What defines the reality of a Yid is halacha. So this is incredible. So halacha tells me I've got 2 layers of schach. Again, we're going to further qualify it. They're now, okay, we'll go with Abaye. They're within 3 tefachim of each other. Your sukkah is kosher. Why? Because the schach provides more shade than sun. Really? I'm putting on SPF, 150, and I'm still getting a sunburn. But you're telling me, no, it's more shade than sun. Isn't that incredible? And halacha will say, yes, my sunburn says otherwise. I am schwitzing like a behema that says otherwise. Don't worry, you're good. It's more shade than sun. I will say such an incredible thing because so often in life, we think we have everything figured out, right? And I see the world and I'm convinced that the way I see the world, the way I see other people, the way I see circumstances, the way I see myself, that's correct. And I will say, that's why a person has to be steeped in Torah, and a person has to be steeped in halacha, and the way we live our lives has to be governed by halacha, because reality is not governed by what we see or how we perceive, but reality is always governed by halacha, by Gemara, by Shulchan Aruch, by Chazal, by Torah. Such an incredible yisod. So the Gemara goes weiter. Aval yesh bein zeh lezeh gimel tefachim psula. So I'll say, but again, Abaye says, so Abaye is qualifying Abaye is qualifying Shmuel's statement, right? That even Shmuel says miduvleles means multi-tiered schach, and we view it all as being compressed. Abaye says that's fine as long as you've got lavud. As long as you've got lavud, as long as there's less than 3 tfachim between the layers. And Rabbi say you could see again. We're not up to it yet. Well, actually, let's go on to the Gemara. Amar Rava. Rava says no, not true, not true. Afilu yesh bein zel lazeh shlosha tfachim. So let's listen to this. Rava says no. Even if there's more than 3 tfachim between the layers, it's still okay. So nami lo arman ella she'ein begago tefach. Aval yesh begago tefach kshira. So we'll say, listen to this. According to Rava, Rava says, this is not a lavud issue. The way this works is that the pieces of schach that are multi-tiered really need to be at least a tefach wide. At least a tefach wide. Rava say, this is picture 135 that you could take a look at. So Rava says, and this picture actually kind of illustrates what's happening over here. So Rava says, the pieces of wood have to be at least 1 tefach wide. If they're 1 tefach wide, Rabbi say you can see over here, you have 2 tiers of schach. And again, I didn't mention this explicitly, but I guess intuitively you probably understood it, which is that the way the schach is arranged, it is in an alternating sequence, right? So you could see that over here. So Rava says like this, that as long as the upper schach is at least a tefach in width, even if the upper and lower schach are more than 3 tefachim away from each other, we view the upper schach as descending into the lower schach. Why? Da'aminan chavot rami. Because Rabbi say we essentially say chavot rami means bring it down, right? Bring it down. Bring it down. Rabbi say, now what does that mean? Chavot rami. Rabbi say, look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Amiran chavot rami. So kishagavo shlosha v'yoser dafi lebapachos migimol lav chavot ushari u'kemush kavalav. Rabbi say this apparently is a new halacha l'Moshe Sinai. I mean, it's not a new halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's a couple thousand years old. But l'maisa, it's another halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's in, by the way, the same family as Pitikra Yored. V'so same, right? Good achis. It's the same idea. But what it says is, when you have a piece of material that is more than 1 tefach wide above another grouping of materials with open spaces, we view the upper area as descending into the lower area, provided that the upper, in this case we'll use schach, right? The upper schach has at least 1 tefach of width. Now we'll say, so I just want to point out over here, Abaye comes along and Abaye says that in order to go ahead and make this multi-tier schach work, it has to be within 3 tefachim of each other. Now we'll say, now what I want to point out is, everyone agrees that works, right? Why does that work? That's lavud. Everybody agrees with lavud, right? So that's not a chiddush. So if you have multi-tiered schach, and ultimately, again, it's within 3 tefachim of each other, and only with lavud does it become more shade than sun, everyone agrees sukkah's kasher. Rava is coming to give an additional chiddush, and Rava is saying, even if the 2 layers of schach are more than 3 tefachim apart, but the upper layer has pieces of material that are more than 1 tefach wide, we view it as 1 compressed schach roof area. Based on what? The halacha l'Moshe Sinai of chavot rami. Bring down the roof. Incredible. Amar Rav Menamila. Rav says, by the way, where do I know this from? Where is this concept mentioned? Both say this is incredible. So where do I know that this halacha l'Moshe Sinai of chavot rami applies when the upper roof or the upper schach is 1 tefach wide, at least 1 tefach wide? So the Gemara says, and where the upper roof does not have a tefach, we don't say chavot rami. So we'll say, I want to point out, when the upper roof has chavot rami, when the upper roof has a tefach of width, we'll say chavot rami. If the upper roof doesn't have a tefach of width, what can you still utilize? Lavud. Right? Lavud. So I just want to point that out. So nevertheless, where do we see? I will say the beauty of chavot rami is that even if the upper roof is way above 3 tefachim, halacha l'maisa, we would allow it to view it as if the upper roof is descending into the open areas of the lower roof. So where do we know this from? This nan we learned koros habayis v'aliyah she'en aleh ma'aziva. If you have literally boards of a home and an upper story that have not been plastered. Vehein mechuvanos, and they are exactly opposite each other. I will say this is picture 136. So in this case over here, if you could imagine, you have a home that's under construction, right? You have a 2-story home. So if you notice again, you have a partial upper story roof and a partial first floor roof, right? Remember again, the first floor roof is the roof for the first floor, the floor of the second floor, and then you have the upper story roof. Now in this case over here, it's only partially boarded. In this case, I want to be clear, the boards themselves are directly on top of each other. That's the case over here. So what's that? Look, I will say, this is actually quite fascinating. Tuma tachas achas mehen. I will say, what happens if you have an item of tuma? Whatever the tuma, you have a corpse, whatever the tummy item is, under one of the boards. So what's the halacha? So tachtel tame. Ultimately, again, anything else underneath the board will be tamei as well. So we learned this in Hilchos Tumah, that essentially, again, anything under the board, right? Remember again, Tumah, the board may prevent the Tumah from going up, but what? It will disperse the Tumah to anything else underneath the board with the Davar HaTamei. Tachas achas mehen, tachtea tamei. Bein tachtona le'alyona. What happens if halacha lamaisa, you have something, you have a tamei item between what we'll call the first story roof and the second story roof? Beinehen tamei. Anything between those two boards will become tamei as well. So we'll say, so if you have a davar tamei situated, this is picture 137. You have a davar tamei in between the first floor and the second floor. So anything underneath that same board as the davar hatamei will be tamei as well. So al gabe ha'alyona, what happens if you have a davar tamei on top of the upper story? That's picture 138. Then halacha l'maisa, so al gabe alyona connecta ad l'rakia tamei. Then I will say, in that case, remember again, where does the tumah go? Ola ubakas. It ascends heavenward, right? It ascends all the way up. So whatever else is in that airspace will become tamei as well. Good. We'll say that's case number 1. Hayu ha'alyonos kebena tachtonos. So we'll say in case number 2, this is picture 139. So we'll say picture 139, same basic idea, which is what? That remember again, you have an upper story, a lower story, partially roofed home. What's the difference in this case? The boards are staggered. So this way, again, essentially, the boards of the upper roof, right, correspond to the open spaces of the board of the roof of the first story. Okay? Hayu elyonos kebena tachtonos. So ultimately, again, if the roof of the upper story corresponded ultimately to the open spaces of the roof of the first story, so what's the halacha? Tuma tachtehen. So I will say if there is a tamei item underneath. Now, what that means is a tamei item underneath one of the boards of the first story. Then ultimately, again, tuma tachtehen tachas kulan tamei al gabehen kinegdan ad l'rakia. So I will say, so again, remember, in this case over here, it's the same concept. In other words, that any davar tamei that's under a board, the tumah keeps the board from going up, but disperses the tumah underneath the board. Same idea. So, Medrar Murim, V'tani Allah, we said about this. When is this so? Medrar Murim, Bizman sheyesh ban tefach ubeinehen poseach tefach. Shabbos say, when is this true? That ultimately, again, that here, we'll say, if you go ahead and let me just illustrate. This would be picture, actually not yet, sorry. When is this? So, bisman sheish b'ayim tefach, when ultimately, again, the boards themselves are tefach in width, u'beinei and poseach tefach, and the open spaces are also a tefach. We'll say, then we allow what? We allow for the roofs to be actually viewed as one compressed roof. Aval ein beinehen poseach tefach. But if halacha lamaisa, the boards were not a tefach, tuma tachas achas mehen tachtea tamei beinehen va'al gabehen tar. So we'll say this is very interesting. Essentially, what the Gemara is saying is as follows: halacha lamaisa. If the boards themselves are a tefach, right, and the open spaces are a tefach, we view it as a compressed roof. So if you take a look, for example, at picture 141. 141. So we'll say, so if you were to go ahead and if you were to view it as one compressed roof, that's actually not the best illustration of it, but if you were to view it as one compressed roof, then what would happen, Abosai? Pretty much any davar hatame under any board would pretty much disperse it along the entire area. Right? As opposed to the previous cases where the tumah was only being dispersed alongst the area of one board, if you view it as one compressed roof, any davar hatame spreads tumah across the entire area, which makes sense because it's all considered to be what? Enclosed and roofed. Enclosed and roofed. So I will say, this is the concept of chavut rami. That halacha l'maisa, essentially if you have we'll call it multiple roofs, but again, the roofs are at least one tefach of space, one tefach of board, and one tefach of open space. Ultimately, again, we allow the roofs to consider it as if they come together to form one enclosed area. That is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So the Gemara goes weiter. Alma ki is beit tefach amiran chavut rami, v'chi les beit tefach lo amiran chavut rami shmamina. So we'll say we have successfully proven that the concept or the halacha l'Moshe Sinai of chavut rami only applies when halacha l'maisa you have upper roof of one tefach. Now we'll say the truth is it could work even if the open space was less than a tefach. Right? Really, the ikr over here is not as much the open space as much as what? As much as it is the board on top, right? That having a board on top of one tefach is what allows it ultimately, again, to descend. Now, truth is, if the space is more than a tefach, that could be a problem. But if it's a tefach or less, it's not a problem. So we'll say, so again, let's just loop this back to Succah. So for Succah purposes, what we have happening over here is as follows. That Rava comes along, Rava comes along and says as follows, that the Succah hamiduvlelas, which is the multi-tiered schach, so obviously if the two tiers are within 3 tefachim of each other, then what? Lava, not a problem. Rav is coming along and saying, even if the two layers are more than 3 tefachim away from each other, as long as the upper schach ultimately, again, is at least 1 tefach wide and corresponds to at least the same size, if not smaller space below it, we view everything ultimately as compressing and forming one roof. And again, even if they're more than 3 tefachim away from each other. Incredible. Yosef Rav Kahana v'kamer l'hashmaisa. So Rav Kahana was sitting and saying over this ruling. Amrli Rav Ashi Rav Kahana v'chol heicha deles beit tefach lo amrin chavot. Is that true? So that whenever, let's say the upper board has less than a tefach, we don't say chavot rami. Is that true? V'tanya we learned. But say a case of a mavui. What happens? Well, remember again, if you have a mavui in an open alleyway, so you need to put a lechi or a korah, a horizontal beam or a vertical beam across the top. So in this case over here, we'll say, look at picture 142. You're putting a beam across the top. But in this case over here, actually what you're doing is you're using two beams, and what happens? They don't quite reach each other. Achas yotze mikosol zeh v'achas yotze mikosol zeh. Or I will say again, this is picture 142. You're using two beams. They don't quite meet each other. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, obviously, if it's less than 3 tefachim from each other, then what? Lavud, and you don't need to go ahead and bring another board. However, shlosha tzarich la v'koreh charas. But I will say, let's say again, in picture 142, if the two beams are more than 3 tefachim from each other, then what? You would need to bring another beam in order to go ahead and span the distance. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Amid Beis, pachos me'arba ein tzarich lahavi koreh charas. We'll say this is very interesting. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, pachos mi'arba. Right? Now, I want to point out, before you turn the page, look at the last Rashi on the Daf. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel svirole, pachos mi'arba lavud b'chol duchta. Rabbi said, this is fascinating. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel argues on the principle of lavud. This is machlokes. I don't know that we've ever actually spoken this out. There is a machlokes about lavud. Is lavud 3 tefachim or is lavud 4 tefachim? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds lavud is 4 tefachim. So again, just the machlokes in lavud. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Omer, Amud Beis, pachos me'arba Ein tzarich lahavi kora achares. Even if it's less than 4 tefachim, you do not have to go ahead and bring another kora. However, arba, if it's more than 4 tefachim, tzarich lahavi kora achares. So we'll say, so fine. So far, not a big deal. Everyone is agreeing that if you're running a pole, right, or you're running a beam across the top of your mavoi in order to quote unquote enclose it. So let's say again you're using 2 poles, and they don't meet each other. If it's less than 3 tefachim, according to the Tanakama, less than 4 tefachim, or Shem Gamliel, you don't need another pole. Lavud, more than 4 tefachim, you would need another pole. We'll say, now watch this. V'chein, shtei koros hamat imos lo bezukadei lakabla ariyach. So also listen to this. Now the halacha is, and this is picture 143, the halacha is that the beam that you put across a mavoi, right? If you put a beam across the top of the mavoi in order to serve as the enclosure, so the halacha is, Rabbi say, that the beam has to be strong enough, I guess thick enough, strong enough, to be able to place a brick on it lengthwise. Right? That's the halacha. Has to be able to support a brick. So the Gemara says, "V'chin shtei koros hamatimos." Let's say you have the following case: I have a beam; it's not strong enough to support a brick. So what do? I bring a second beam, and I just put the 2 beams. That's the picture. Whether you could, I don't know if you could see that on 143. Right? It's 2 beams. It's 2 beams side by side. 2 beams side by side. Right? V'chin shtei koros hamatimos lo bezukadei lakabel ariyach. Neither one by itself has the ability to support a brick. V'lo bezula kadei lekabel ariyach. Im mekablos ariyach l'rachbo tefach. Right? In tzarich lahavi kora achares. We'll say if they have the ability to go ahead and support, right, and support a brick, right. So in other words, if the 2 beams together create a tefach of width, so as to be able to support a brick along their width, then halacha l'maisa, or along their length, well, they have a width of a tefach to be able to support the brick, then ultimately, in tzarich lahavi kora achares. You don't have to bring another board, or another beam. Ve'im lav, but we'll say if there's not enough strength amongst those 2 beams to support the brick, then tzarich lahavi kora achares. You have to bring another beam. Rabbi Shimon says, "Im mekablos ariyach la'arko shlosha tefachim ein tzarich lahavi kora achares." So let's listen to this. Rabbi Shimon says that halacha l'maisa, as long as they have the ability to go ahead and support a brick that has a length, ultimately again, of 3 tefachim, then that is going to be enough. We'll say that's picture 144. Ve'im lav tzarich lahavi kora achares. Okay, so I'll say these are fine. These are actually not the cases we're focusing on. Here's what we're focusing on. Hayu achas lemala v'achas lemata. What happens if one beam was higher than the other? So we'll say this is picture 145. Picture 145. What happens if we'll say I have 2 beams? One is higher than the other.
Why 2 beams?
What? So you're going to see why I will say. Remember again, back to our Eruvin days. So remember again, in order for the beam across the top of the mavoi to work, it must have at least the tefach of width, right? The tefach of width. Now we're dealing with, I have 2 beams. Let's call for argument's sake, each of them are a half a tefach. Okay? So in an ideal world, how would I set up those 2 beams? Side by side. Don't ask why, but I'll say, what am I doing? I'm putting 1 beam on top of the other. Right? 1 beam on top of the other. Remember again, each of them only has a half a tefach. I need them together in order to form the tefach requisite shear. Hayu achas lamala v'achas lamata. If one was above and one was below. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Huda Omer, Rowan ha'elyona, ki'ilu hi lamata, ve'es ha'tachtona, ki'ilu hi lamala. So not a problem. We view the upper beam as if it's below, and the bottom beam as if it is above. Right? So in other words, we could view the beams as being right next to each other. Or bilvad, shelo tehei elyona lamala me'esrim amo, va'tachtona lamata me'esrim. As long as the upper beam is not more than 20 amas off the ground, and the lower beam is not less than 10 tfachim. Ha-zeh v'zeh b'soch esrim. What do you see from here? As long as both beams are within 20 amas, amrinan chavot rami. we say Chavot Rami, even though what? Afal Gav Deles Be Tefach. Rabbi will say, wow. What did we just get finished doing on Amud Aleph? What did we just get finished saying? There's Halach L'Moshe Sinei Chavot Rami that says you can essentially allow two different tiers of roofing to form one compressed roof area. We qualify that as saying as long as what? The upper, right? As long as the upper one has at least one tefach of space, one tefach of width. And then again, and I will say now the chiddush there is, and then even if the two roof levels are much more than 3 tefachim apart, we can view them as becoming one compressed roof area. I will say, what did we just say over here? We just said that if you have two poles, remember how wide are the poles in these cases? Less than a tefach, right? Less than a tefach. And I will say this is pretty dramatic. As long as the upper one is less than 20 amas high, and the bottom one is more than 10 tefachim off the ground, then what? They could combine. How are they combining, Abba? Say, how are they combining? It must be Chavot Rami. And yet what do we see? It's working even if what? Even if the poles have less than a tefach of width. Incredible. So the Gemara says, no. Amrle, taritz ve'emahachi. Here's how you have to read it. Afal gab taritz ve'emahachi. O bilvad, no, here's how you have to read it. Shalot he alyona l'mala me'esrim, ela b'soch esrim, v'atachtona smucha la b'pachos mishlosha. Oh, well, so what are we talking about? The Gemara says, no, what you have to read is like this. You could combine, you could see the two poles as combining, becoming one, as long as what? The upper one is not more than 20 amas high, and the lower one is within 3 tefachim of the upper one. Inami, or the other possibility is, or if the bottom pole is lower than 10 tefachim, but above 10 tefachim, ve'alyona smucha la bepachos mishlosha, and the upper one is within 3 tefachim of the lower one. I will say, listen to this. So therefore, the Gemara is just saying, no. When can they combine without a tefach? When can they combine with lavud? Aval shlosha kevan deles be tefach lo arminon chavot rami. But I will say, if they're more than 3 tefachim apart and less than a tefach in width, then what? They do not combine. Because the Gemara suggests that halacha l'maisa, the halacha l'moshe misinai of chavot rami, only applies when the roof, we'll call it the roof, right? The planks, the schach, only has at least one tefach of wide space. And I will say, that is indeed how the Rambam paskins with the halacha l'moshe misinai of chavot rami. He holds that, again, let me see if I could isolate it here. He says, he says, I'll just give you the Maramakom. It's Hilchas Tumas Meis, Perek Tezayin Halacha Vav, where the Rambam quotes this Halacha L'Moshe Misinai of Chavot Rami, and ultimately understands that it only applies with if the roofing material is at least 1 tefach wide. So I will say, so really quite fascinating. So remember again, lavud, in general, it's good to know, lavud is your best friend. Lavud, there are certain things in life you could always count on. Lavud is one of them, right? If you're within 3 tefachim, lavud's got your back, right? You're always good. Anything goes pretty much when you're within 3 tefachim. Once you get out of 3 tefachim, you have chavot rami. But chavot rami, again, the beauty of chavot rami is even if you're much more than 3 tefachim away from the next roofing area, it works. But again, provided that you have at least 1 tefach of space. Incredible. So let's go back. Let's finish the Mishnah. Now, and this is very interesting. The Mishnah said, as long as the sukkah provides more shade than sun, it's kosher. So says the Gemara, a fascinating inference. Ha ki hadadi psula. We'll say, what happens if a sukkah provides exactly the same amount of shade as sun? So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah said, if the sukkah provides more shade than sun, the sukkah is kosher. What happens if it's mamish chatzi, right? Exactly the same amount of shade in the sun. Well, you could infer from the Mishnah that such a sukkah would be puzzle. Because in order for the sukkah to be kosher, what has to happen? It has to provide what? More shade than sun. But we learned v'shechamasa meruba mitzilasa psula. We learned earlier on that what? That if the sukkah allows in more sun than shade, the sukkah is going to be puzzle. What can you infer from that? Ha ki adadi kshera. What I infer from that is if they provide the exact amount of sun, same amount of sun and shade, then what? It should be kosher. So both say, here the Shali, we have contradictory inferences. From our Mishnah, it sounds like if it's exactly the same amount of sun and shade, then what? It's possible. From the earlier Mishnah, it sounds like if it's the same amount of sun and shade, it should be kosher. Lo kasher. Both listen to this. Kan milamala, kan milamata. Both say this is fascinating. It depends on where you're looking at this from. Are you looking at this from schach level, or are you looking at this from the interior of the sukkah? See, Abosai, the Gemara assumes that whatever amount of sun the schach allows in, there'll be even more actual light inside of the sukkah. So here's what's interesting. If from the schach perspective, from the thickness of the schach perspective, you see that the schach is allowing in exactly the same amount of sun than shade, that sukkah is going to be pasul. Why? Because again, if it's 50-50 on the schach level, it means it'll be more than 50-50 on the interior of the sukkah. However, if on the interior of the sukkah it's 50-50, that'll be kosher. Why? Because that means from the schach level, there's actually more shade than sun. Just a difference in perspective. Or I should say a difference from where you're, it's not really, it's a difference from where you're measuring the shade-sun ratio. So Rav Papa says, this is what people always say. What do people always say? Kizuza milael, ki istra milatachas. I mean, come on, who doesn't use this phrase all the time? Right? People say this all the time. What do people say? If it's the size of a zuz on top, it'll be the size of an istira on the bottom. Which I will say essentially means, if you can imagine, if you have a tiny hole on a roof that allows in only a small amount of sunlight, the size of a zuz, when the sun actually comes in, the light will diffuse even more the size of an istira. So therefore, I will say, again, everything depends on where you're measuring the shade-sun ratio. If you're measuring a shade-sun ratio by looking at the schach, and it's 50-50, exactly the same amount of sun than shade, then halacha l'maisa, that is going to allow in even more sun, it's going to provide for even more light inside the sukkah itself. So if it's 50-50 inside of the sukkah, then you're good to go. It's 50-50 on top of the schach, then it's going to be problematic. Good. But let's just finish up. Says the Gemara, mu'uva kamim bayis. Ultimately, again, right. I want to make sure I said that right. Right. That if it's ki adadi, if it's exactly the same amount of sun than shade, if that's a din, ultimately, again, in the schach, then the schach is going to be possible. The interior, it will be kosher. Good. Says the Gemara. Muva kimim bayis. Let's just finish up the Mishnah. Remember, again, the Mishnah said that if halacha l'maisa, you have so much schach that it's schach as thick as a roof of a home, the sukkah is still going to be kosher. Tanra hamuva kimim bayis afal pishina kochavim nira misocha kshera halacha l'maisa. If you went ahead and you put so much schach on your sukkah that it is so thick that what you can't even see the stars, kshera. Ultimately, again, sukkah is still kosher. Ein koch ve'echama mira misocha. What happens if halacha l'maisa the schach is so kosher that you can't even see sunlight inside of the sukkah? Then what? Beis Shammai poslim. Beis Shammai says the sukkah is pasul. Or Beis Hillel machshir. Beis Hillel says ultimately again the sukkah will be kosher. So I will say this. Actually, I want to just end off with this because this is a fascinating halacha l'maisa. I put out in the WhatsApp chat also a copy of the Shulchan Aruch over here. All right. First of all, the Shulchan Aruch says in Sif Aleph, Taf Reish Lamed Aleph, says sukkah shechamasa v'tzilasa shavin milamala. This we just said this halacha. A sukkah that has exactly the same amount of sun and shade as measured on the schach level, psula. That sukkah's pasul. Lefi shechamasa mispashetes berichuka v'yiyah lemata chamasa meruba mitzilasa. Because again, if a sukkah is 50-50 on the schach level, it'll be chamasa meruba mitzilasa, more sun in the sukkah level, in the interior of the sukkah. Avalim chamasa mitzilasa shava milamata. But if ultimately again the sun and shade are shava in the interior of the sukkah, then ultimately it's going to be kosher. Good. But say, what about the last halacha very quickly? Halacha gimel derech hasichoch lios kal kedishir menu akochavim gdolim. Ideally, the schach should be spaced enough that you're able to see large stars at night when sitting in a sukkah. What happens if you make your schach so thick that it's like the roof of a home? Even though you can't go ahead and see any stars on the inside, kshera. ultimately, again, the sukkah will still be kosher. Now, the Mishnah Berurah comments on this, and the Mishnah Berurah says, but you need to be able to see sun, some amount of sun, and he says, furthermore, if your schach is so thick that when it rains, no rain gets into the sukkah, Mishnah Berurah says that's a problem. However, he says in those cases still b'diavad halacha l'maisa. If you so also he does an interesting case. Sometimes if you have to make your schach that thick in order that the schach doesn't blow away. Let's say you have to compact your schach in order that the schach stays on the sukkah. The Mishnah Berurah says in all of these cases, even if it doesn't rain in the sukkah, and even if you can't see the sun in the sukkah, bidi evet it is going to be kosher. But lechatchila, the schach should be thick enough that it provides more shade than sun. But again, we'll call it sparse enough that you can be able to see the large stars at night. All right, I'll say stop here. Shkoyach.